Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video on mental illness and the factors and the relationship between that and different cultures. This is part of the psychological health and well-being topic for stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So let's first recap the DSM5 and how it defines mental illness. So the DSM5 describes mental disorders as syndromes characterized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflect a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. So mental illness, as it says there, is usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. So there's significant distress involved and it negatively affects day-to-day functioning in some way, whether it is cognitively, psychologically, biologically, etc. So we need to obviously look at this in a lot more detail when it comes to individual differences and, of course, each individual case of mental illness. So an acceptable or culturally approved response to a common stressor, such as the death of a loved one, is not classified as a mental health disorder. So responding to stressors or negative things that happen in one's life, obviously it's expected that someone would feel grief or sadness or anger or fear or very negative emotions, but that does not automatically mean that they have a mental disorder. So it's important when we look at the DSM-5 and the criteria that we take individual differences into account and what's actually going on in that person's world. And one of the main factors that we need to be very mindful of is someone's culture. So a major problem or an issue with the DSM-5 is that mental disorder definitions, they're very culturally constructed. So what that means is that they don't take into account other cultural differences in behaviors and practices. So in many cultures around the world, the examples pictured here, all right, and according to the DSM-5 would be seen as abnormal. However, there are many other cultures globally that make modifications, for example, to their body for traditional or religious purposes. It doesn't mean that they have a mental health disorder, it's just culturally appropriate or culturally traditional, depending on where someone is in the world. Whereas the DSM-5 would automatically, according to the wording of a lot of the illnesses, class them as being, for example, eccentric or bizarre in their behavior, and that they may have diagnosis or criteria for diagnosis of a mental health disorder when that's actually not the case. So as we can see here, this girl is attending a cosplay event which requires players to wear costumes as part of their performances. And again, given the social context of cosplay, that's completely appropriate. However, just seeing someone dressed up like this, according to the DSM-5, that may be grounds for bizarre behavior or maladaptive behavior, and that's one of the criteria for a mental health disorder, when that's actually, of course, not what's going on. So context is everything, and that's why we take culture into massive effect, or we take culture into consideration when looking at different definitions and different diagnosis rates. There's also the very famous cat man. All right, you've seen him in your workbooks. He has spent more than $200,000 US to look like a cat and has recently added implanted whiskers. Now, again, according to the DSM-5, he would be potentially mentally unwell, but that's obviously not the case, all right? Yes, he's eccentric in the way that he looks, but he doesn't automatically qualify to be diagnosed as being mentally unwell. It's just a personal lifestyle choice that he has decided to adopt. Again, here, boys engaging in a football game barefoot aligns with the social norms of their culture. So as bizarre it may look to one culture, it's completely normal to another or completely typical. So we must take culture into account when obviously diagnosing and looking at mental illness, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of culture and demographics. So the photos, again, once put into context, no longer fit the criteria of abnormality or being mentally ill. So it's all about context, and you guys know how much I love that word. So clinicians need to understand the cultural background of their patients, including attitudes and belief systems, and make sure that's taken into account before any diagnosis is made. So it is also important to acknowledge that culture plays a significant role in mental health. So, for example, whether people seek help, how they describe their symptoms, if mental illness is culturally accepted, and how much stigma they attach to the illness. So different cultures will have different levels of stigma in terms of if it's okay for people to reach out and so on, because of the resources and the funding that psychology get, depending on what country someone is in or where they are in the world. So obviously, significant advancements in science, research, and cultural development has resulted in increased acceptance and treatment of mental illness. So psychology is a science, as we know, and because of that, we have made significant advancements in the field and an increased awareness of what mental health is and what mental illness is and the treatment that goes along with it. We still have a long way to go, obviously. It's certainly not perfect, but we've made enormous strides since psychology was first introduced and developed as a science. So in ancient times, it was believed that psychological distress was caused by demons and exorcisms were common. Another treatment was, as we can see here, trephination, all right, which is a procedure involved drilling holes into the skull. And the middle of the 19th century saw a push for more humane asylums for the mentally ill as psychology advanced, of course. So that just gives you a little bit of a recap of mental illness and culture and why we need to very much emphasize taking that into account when looking at mental illness, and particularly the DSM-5, because it is quite biased. If I just go back here, it is quite biased towards a Western culture. Whereas obviously we live in a world where there are different cultures and different practices. So we need to take culture into account while also looking at the criteria of the DSM-5. So I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.